The fundamental problem that nobody anticipated in 1998 when the UK got devolution in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland was that the UK might in time leave the European Union. The devolution settlement was very different in the 90s from what was anticipated in the 1970s, in that essentially it was a model between powers that were devolved and powers that were reserved. But the essential point was that anything that was not actually explicitly reserved was devolved. Now, that was actually very important in certain contexts like agriculture and fisheries, where the European Union set the framework. So the European Union set the framework for policy within significant areas in terms of, for example, state aids, agricultural support, certain kinds of economic development, fisheries, and such like. And what actually happened is that within that framework, one could extensively devolve the essential administration of those policy areas to the devolved administrations, because the framework was a common European Union framework. What nobody anticipated is that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union with the result that one would need a separate United Kingdom framework within which to operate. It is not in the interests of the devolved nations to have a competition for state aid subsidy, for agricultural subsidy, or for fisheries policy between the different parts of the European Union. The problem is that the United Kingdom government, particularly since 2010, tends to see the devolved administrations as essentially inferior to itself. And rather than being willing to work on a common framework that is agreed between the governments, the United Kingdom government regards it as something that is not that important, but which it will actually impose on the devolved administrations. And essentially that's why it was described, the UK policy was described by the Welsh and the Scottish governments as a power grab, and why the Scottish government continues to refuse to agree to put a consent motion in front, legislative consent motion in front of the Scottish Parliament. In terms of what actually happens to the expenditure which has been funded by Europe out of the common pool of European funds, in terms of what actually happens after Brexit, the important point is that expenditure is very unequally distributed across the nations and regions of the United Kingdom. It is much more important, for example, in agriculture to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland than it is on average to England. So that raises the question of how the repatriated expenditure is dealt with. Now, I don't have a great deal of policy competence in the areas. My competence is very much in terms of the financial issues and the public finance matters. There are various models that one could operate, but all those models depend on a very informal system of internal United Kingdom financial management. So, for example, the money that is now spent in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on expenditure repatriated could be put into the Barnett formula, which is the mechanism for distributing funds distributing increase in funds between the different parts of the United Kingdom. There's always question about policy control. If policy control is retained at the United Kingdom level on those areas, the devolved administrations will actually have no policy control over what the additional expenditure in their nations and regions actually is. So one has to think about how the policy allocation relates to the question of funding. Now, the money could go into the Barnett formula to just be part of the general pool of money which the Parliament's got to spend. But the important point to remember is that will then create tensions within those devolved polities between how much you spend on nurses for the National Health Service and how much you spend on sheep subsidies for farmers. So some issues that were resolved externally to the devolved nations are actually going to be very important. There are alternative financial models you could adopt. So, for example, it could be managed at the UK level in terms of what the United Kingdom Treasury calls annually managed expenditure, whereby any expenditure in the devolved nations within the framework of the UK policy will actually be funded by the Treasury out of this pool of money held at the Treasury. It could either be held at the Treasury as annual managed expenditure, or it could be essentially devolved in administrative terms to devolved administration. So there's a question about who controls the policy and actually who controls the money. The essential point, however, is the difficulties are political because of the challenge to the devolution settlements of 1999 that is actually created by Brexit and by the attitude of the United Kingdom government. So essentially, we're talking ourselves into a constitutional crisis, which in the short run will unquestionably be won by the United Kingdom. But one doesn't have much idea about what the potential consequences will be for the future integrity of the United Kingdom if the devolution settlement is seen to be rolled back.